Okay, cool. This is a pretty good number right from the get-go. I'm gonna get us started. Awesome. So hey everyone, welcome to the Philly IGDA meeting for November 2021. I'm Adrian Sandoval and I am the chair of the Philadelphia chapter of the International Game Developers Association. We're a global organization that's dedicated to the enrichment and advocacy of game developers. Here in Philadelphia, we're dedicated to supporting our fast-growing professional network, as well as our active indie and academic community. Excuse me. If you'd like more information on the IGDA, please head over to igda.org. Consider becoming a member for various benefits, including an invite to the official IGDA Discord server, which can give you access to a professional network of over 1,000 developers from around the world. As for us here in Philadelphia, we like to hold monthly events such as the one you are at now on the second Tuesday of every month. So please be sure to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or check out our website at philly.igda.org to keep up to date on all of our events as they're happening. Also, be sure to check out our YouTube channel to see recordings of previous meetings, including this one in the near future, and consider subscribing. We also have a Discord channel, so you can reach out to us as well as other members of Philly's vibrant game development community are out there to chat with you immediately, which is free to access for everyone in Philadelphia, regardless of your IGDA membership status. One last note, please know that we do have a code of conduct, which you can read in full at our website, but please keep in mind all of our events and communities are safe, inclusive spaces, and please respect each other in your communication in our chat room, when our live events, when we start those up again there as well, and any of our online spaces, such as our Discord server. So tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome Guillaume Colomb, narrative lead at Bungie, who's going to be talking about his work helping to create and maintain the long-running narrative of Destiny 2, which is currently on its 15th season. It's been running since the launch back in 2018. Writing a compelling story and world for a game that doesn't continue to evolve over time, that's already a difficult and very rewarding process. So I'm really excited to hear about the unique challenges for getting to continue that narrative over time and through new content. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to Guillaume.
Thank you, Adrian. So like Adrian said, my name is Guillaume Colomb. I'm here to talk about storytelling in Destiny, but specifically I'm going to focus on the storytelling in a game as a service. And I'm very excited to be here because when I first moved to the United States in 2011, I was actually living in Philadelphia, and I came to the IGDA meetings every month. So I'm really happy to do this today. So I personally have been working in video games for around 15 years. Mostly on action adventure games as a thematic director, narrative designer, and currently, like Adrian said, I'm a narrative lead at Bungie. My focus is on the annual release. We are a big team. The team is focused on the seasonal stories, and me and my team working on the annual release. The next one that is coming out in February is The Witch Queen. So today we are going to talk about storytelling in a game as a service. So I'll speak about how Destiny evolved since its launch to become a model of live storytelling that it is today. I'll break down what I mean when I talk about storytelling in a game as a service. But first, I want to talk about game as a service. Actually, before that, I'm curious to know who in the audience actually played Destiny before. So I know I can ask a few questions and you can raise your hand. So if you had played Destiny, raise your hands like that. Perfect. So that I know who's the audience. Okay, almost half apparently. Great. So don't worry if you haven't played Destiny. There's still going to be plenty of things to understand, I hope. And I'm going to talk about what Destiny is in a moment too. Like I said, first, let's talk about what a game as a service is. So to understand why we have game as a service today, I like to go back in time a little bit, and specifically in 1993. Doom comes out, and not only it was a very exciting new 3D game at the time, that was kind of new. You could play in the LAN network with friends, and if you had multiple PC with network cards and cables, and that's what I did most of that summer. I played hours and hours of Doom with my friends, StarCraft and Command and Conquer and all those games. So this is not the first time I was playing video games with my friends, but that setup required a lot of work, moving computers, big screens, substantial amount of setup. And we spent the whole day at lunch together, sometimes dinner. There were breaks, discussion, there was a lot of bonding. That moment, being with friends and having fun, it's really what a game as a service they're about. Game as a service is kind of a dry way to call it. We sometimes call it game as a platform. It's a term I like better that helps us understand what it is game as a hobby. So it's something that I do to connect with other people that we have a shared interest. So the connectivity to others is crucial in a game as a service. And more than anything, you have to understand what the platform is, why it exists, and what need is satisfied to players that they can't find in any other games. So a game as a service is taking the role of what we call a third place. If you're not familiar with the concept of a third place, it's a place or a moment where you gather with your community, where you feel comfortable, welcomed, accepted. The first place is your home, and the second place is your workplace. The third place could be a park, a social club, a church, a coffee shop. But you can also have a virtual third place. And technology allows us to stay home, to find friends, and again, engage with our friends, even more for the past 2 years. So thinking of the game as a service, as a place where you go hang out, help understand how different the experience is. So what does it have to do with storytelling? Well, the platform is different. So the way you want to tell story has to be different. It's not a story that is being told to you. It's more a place you go where stories are being told. So let's see how different game as a service are to other games. And we call all our other games game as a product. So there's two different type of platform, means two different type of games. So let's see what type of game exists as a box product. I'm sure you all know those games. And on the other side, here's what some game as a service are. One thing that stands out right away is how this game approaches the player role in the experience. Like on the left, the players are on a predetermined path with options, but predetermined options. On the right, there might be a part of it that is predetermined, but for the most part, there is a large freedom in the experience. There isn't also an end to the experience pretty often. If there is one, it's so far out that it will require hundreds of hours to accomplish it. The big difference in my experience as a player is better when I play with friends. The game is made to be played with a community, not just one or two friends. So as a player, my personal experience is qualitatively different than the one that my friend had. On the left, my experience and my friend's experience will be pretty similar. We can talk about moments in a game the same way we would talk about the scene in a movie. And on the right, it's not so much about what you did, but it's more about how you did it, or what you were able to find and collect that your friends might not have, or may have done it differently. So it's not so clear of a difference most of the time. Box product can share some of the element too, and some of the game as a product can share some element of the box product. So it's not binary. You can kind of plug them on spectrum. So I would kind of put those games like that. On the very far, Mario is really linear and directed. It's kind of not really open world. There's some freedom, but it's very directed. And on the other side, on the other hand, it's you can look at Fortnite, for example, that while being a shooter as its main game mechanic, they really think of it as a place. Like, for example, they organize concerts in it. And Animal Crossing is the same thing. It's like, it's mostly a location, a place. You're organizing your virtual home and you're visiting your friend's home. So what is critical to understand when creating a game as a service is to know where does the game live on that range. Because if your game as a service is offering experience similar to a box as a product, at least on a narrative side, it won't work, and vice versa. But let's look at how specifically it impacts storytelling. So I've identified 6 main areas that are unique to a game as a service that directly impacted the way we tell stories in Destiny. We've learned how to adjust our content over the years and through the evolution of Destiny from a box product to a game as a service. So here's the 6 areas. I'm going to dive deeper in each one of those. So I'm not going to read them now. So the first one, access to content. So the first difference is really how players decide to engage with the game. For a box product, you buy the box from a store, real or digital, one fixed price to access all the game. In a game as a service, there's usually multiple ways to engage with the game. While some part could be free to play, there is all the time additional economy with its own currency. There can be expansions to buy, seasonal content, microtransactions. All of that means that all the players are not coming in a game the same way, and they're not experiencing the same amount of content. That has a direct impact on the way you tell stories. In the box product, all players start at the same place, and you can bring them on a journey, holding their hands along the way. You are in control of what they discover, all players. The further you go in a story, in a box product, the more you lose players. If you look at that graph, it shows that in recent games, the completion rate of a box product with a substantial story is below 50% at best. So more than half of the player will not know the end of your story. If you want to do a sequel, you have a real challenge to overcome because they might not know the story that happened just before. In a game as a service, you need the number of people in your game to be constant or growing. So you need to structure your story in a way that allow them to follow easily. And have regular entry points are welcoming new players. You also need to think of the social aspect. Let's say if you have a friend that wants you to join and to play that game as a service that he or she has been playing for a year or two, you don't want to have to play 10 hours of expansion before being able to play together. And when you do jump in, you also want to be able to understand what's going on in the game story right away. So that was about how players access the game story in a game as a service. So the second area of a game as a service that impact narrative is how players consume the story. A game as a service needs to provide content for players regularly on up to a weekly cadence. It's maybe the thing that is the hardest to nail down. When you watch a TV series like a HBO series, you get 1 hour of content a week. You don't get mad because it's only 1 hour. You expect it to be that way. There isn't yet a great framework for a game as a service. So players don't really know what to expect. But what they do expect is to get content being regularly updated, to get a stream of content. That impacts storytelling in several ways. First, a stream means that it never ends. So the story can never end. It's a balancing act between giving satisfying resolutions while still maintaining some mystery open. One way to do it is to rely on cliffhangers. If you look at the standard story structure like this, so it's a very simplified representation of a classic 3-act story structure, where the red line is the main plot, the blue line is a secondary plot. Ending in a cliffhanger means postponing the resolution on the next release. So the story told through 1 year could look like that, and the structure of a never-ending story would look like this. Overlapping structures from release to release. cliffhangers in a story is a really powerful tool. It's easy to tend to overuse cliffhangers in a serialized framework. The risk is to wear out the player's patience. Eventually, they might just stop waiting. So the first learning about how to deliver a story through a stream of content. You need to have a story that never ends, but still have satisfying resolution. 2, in a box product with many years between games, you could assume that your players have a minimal knowledge of what happened before, or they have an easy path to catch up. Like we said before, more than half people don't know how your story ends. So you need to decide what content is important for a long-term story, what can be archived, and when is to stay forever. The amount of content that keeps growing year after year is a big problem because it had to stop somewhere. So you have to make a decision about what are the prioritization of the stories. The amount of content that we deliver creates another problem, is that if you do archive some story, it can create a fear of missing out. So not every player can or wants to log in every week to see what's new. So you have to think about providing avenues for players to access old content, or you take the risk to create stress and anxiety about player playing the game. And that's obviously not something that you want your player to feel. Because the new content is coming out so quickly, there is also an expectation from players that the next story will be moving forward element of the previous one. It's again, a balancing act to create stories that are connected in a serialized way, but not too much so that new players can jump in and get engaged with it. And finally, the 5th thing about streaming of content is that you need to plan ahead. The audience, the player love to see connection with past content. You can't just make things up as you go. So a narrative roadmap helps you plant seeds and foreshadow big story beats. The game as a service is a hobby. The next area I'm going to talk about is a direct consequence of the time players spend in the game. So when you buy a box product, what matters is that the player expected value of the product matches the experience of playing the game. With a game as a service, it's more than that. There is an expectation of service, not just about the quality of the content, but long-term service to players. For narrative, this translates into how real is the story. By real, I mean, how much does it matter to the game? For a player to care about the story, the player's actions need to matter in the game, which means that the accomplishment they make, like for example, finishing a raid, which is a pinnacle activity in Destiny, or the item they acquire, like for example, an exotic weapon that is very rare to find, the impact they have on the world, all that matter to them. So it should matter to the game. For example, if you saved a character's life in an expansion, a few years later, the same character do not remember what the player did, it breaks the immersion and it slowly chips away at the engagement. Invested player expect more from a game as a service than they would from one of box product experience. Storytelling is about change. One of the big challenges in a game as a service is the amount of content that needs to be created to satisfy that stream of content. That's why you have to rely a lot on reuse and replay. Reuse is not a bad thing. What is bad is when the player sees it and experiences a lack of variety. Same for replayability. It's okay to ask players to replay the same content, as long as they get something from it, that they feel that their time is valued. In a typical linear story, you can rely on a climactic event that concluded a great story. And looking back at our story graph, those big story beats would be here, here, and here. In a game as a service, those are spread over the hundreds of hours that you would play within 1 year. So we need those big story beats. They are impactful. They need to be present to move the story forward and the world. But they are also very expensive to make. So we can't just add more in that 1 year. The big challenge is to find impactful story moment that keeps the player engaged without bankrupting the production. Next, calendar matters. In a box product, when you buy the game, you can play the game at any time during the year. 6 months later, the game will most likely be the exact same. In a game as a service, depending on when you play, you might see some content that wouldn't be available at another time of the year. Like here in Animal Crossing, you can only get a great white shark in summer during the day, the hours of the day. I know because I saw my son worked hard to get the great white shark. He went to the game day after day to try to get it. And when he did, he was excited. So that creates variety. That's create another reason to log in regularly and reinforce that sense of a third place, because it's a living place that evolves independently of me or my action. Finally, the last big area that impacts storytelling in a game as a service is the player story. More specifically, it's a player's identification with the character they are controlling. So the player has to be at the center of the experience, not the character the player is controlling, but the player. Of course, the character is the way the player interacts with the world, and that character needs to have a livable place in that world. But the reason why it has to be about the player and not a specific character is that, for example, people enjoy being someone else for a while, like going through Kratos' journey in God of War or Nathan Drake adventure in Uncharted. But they don't want to be that one character for thousands of hours or only playing that for a year long. Making it about the player and offering them ways to be in the world ensure that they can invest their time in the game in a very personal way. And in Pokemon Go, for example, that's me, we can equip a mask on our avatar. The pandemic is not an event in the game world, but that sense of identification and representation is core to what a game as a service is. Like I mentioned before, a third place is a place where you feel welcome and accepted. For a game as a service to attract players, the world created needs to be welcoming to everyone and offer many avenues for self-expression. Okay, now we talked about those 6 areas. They might seem obvious now, and when you look at game as a service, but often it's not so much about knowing what the problem is, it's finding the solution that is right for you. So I'm going to now talk about Destiny specifically. It took us years to get where we are today. We definitely don't have all the answers, and we're not done learning and improving the game. So I'm going to go through our learning journey in Destiny through those 6 areas. But first, half of the people I would say didn't play Destiny, so I'm going to talk about quickly what Destiny is. So what is Destiny? It's an online-only multiplayer first-person shooter developed by Bungie and released in 2014, so 7 years ago. It's a sci-fi fantasy futuristic story that takes place in a post-apocalyptic world. So it's a multiplayer game. Some aspects are competitive and some are co-op. There's a big social aspect to the game. Player can gather in an area where no combat is allowed, called the Tower. The story is complex. It's been 7 years that we keep adding stories and content to it. But here's a very high-level story. Nowadays, roughly, a mysterious entity called the Traveler showed up in our solar system. It helped spur the golden age on Earth. Its ancient enemy followed here pyramid ship, as you see there. After destructive conflict that kills almost all humanity, the traveler sacrificed itself to repel that enemy and created the ghost. That's a ghost, our ghost. The ghosts are a little sentient drone who can choose a dead human to make them the guardian. When they do, that person loses the memory of their life until that moment, and they're like a blank page. Players are playing a guardian, and they have the ability to wield the power of the traveler, so light, which manifests in a lot of cool powers. Guardian have been protecting what's left of humanity since that apocalyptic event in one city that we call the Last City, and the traveler is hovering above. There are 4 main enemy factions that I'm going to talk a little bit later. The Fallen, the Cabal, the Vex, and the Hive. Now, so let's dive into how Destiny evolved in storytelling to adapt to the constraint of the game as a service model. Like we said, Destiny 1 came out in 2014. There's been a lot of learning and improvement, but the core of what Destiny is was already there. And that's the most important part of all this. More than anything, you need to understand what you're trying to make. In the case of Destiny, it definitely didn't work perfectly from the start, but there was a vision. And that vision has been the guiding North Star since then. At times we steer away, we made mistakes. Other times we got things right. So it's been a learning journey that led us where we're at today. And to put things in perspective, this is where we were roughly 7 years ago. And that's where we're today. Definitely different reviews that we got specifically about storytelling. So how did we get here? Well, first, it's about really understanding what we were trying to create. What is the DNA of Destiny? And part of that starts with understanding who you are. Bungie has a pretty clear editorial line. It's reflected in the main value that they put on the website, which is we create worlds that inspire friendship. That social aspect of the game is very important. There was early on a desire for Destiny to become that third place for players. You can already see it in Bungie's previous game. I mentioned Doom earlier, but a few years later, Halo came out, and it was a very important milestone for me and my friendship. So we gathered and played a lot around that game. So part of that evolution for Destiny was to adapt to a framework that worked with the vision that was laid out in 2014. And that framework is game as a service. So let's dive into that evolution. Destiny 1 came out as a box product. There was 2 DLC or expansion that were published that same year, in December and in May. So they each had their own story and introduced new characters. Some element of a game as a service were already there. Some close actually to what it still is today, like identification with the player. This was a feature that was core to the vision. It was present from day one. There was multiple story beats within a year. So while not really a stream of content, there was a desire to tell story regularly. But the stories were told still through the framework of a box product that were not directly connected, and they focus on isolated characters and destinations without really moving the world forward. Next year, the Taken King came out. It improved on the storytelling, on the craft itself, on a better story, more character focused, more clarity. But it didn't really change the way it embraced game as a service. So the one improvement that it had is that it brought up some seasonal event, which made the calendar matter more. But there was no DLC that year. So it was just one big annual release and a few seasonal content without really bringing new stories. The year after, 2016, Rise of Iron came out. So this, the game still follows the same structure of the Taken King. The improvement this year is more around how we look at the player. I personally always look at a new release of Destiny through three things: the theme, the tone, and the fantasy. The fantasy speaks directly to the player identification. It's a promise that the game is giving to the player. So I always found that image of Rise of Iron very successful in communicating the fantasy of the release. The character with the armor, the furs, the wolves, the axe, there's a clear identity. I often bring that image as a reference in other meetings when we try to nail down the theme, tone, and fantasy. So in that sense, Rise of Iron really understood how important it was for the player to identify themselves with a fantasy. Then came Destiny 2 in 2017. And this is how we did. So first, talking about reuse and replay. Destiny 2 has a great campaign. 17 missions, many cinematics, an epic story that spans 4 destinations. But the end game is lacking. After the campaign, the world didn't really have a good reason to exist. So in the last mission of the campaign, we killed the leader of the Cabal. But there's still a lot of Cabal combatants all over the world. So the world did not change or evolve based on our player action. So it left the player a little confused and wanting more for the end game. For the access to content, the 2 expansions that year were not really full new expansions, while still kind of looking like a full expansion. A new character, a new story with cinematics, a new destination, but they lived in a serialized structure without having a serialized story. And again, there was a mismatch between the player expectation and what we delivered. Stream of content, same thing. They're still isolated stories that are not connected to each other and not really moving the world forward. So while we delivered a lot of content in each of those DLC, it wasn't enough to satisfy players. But to produce that amount of content, we had to rely on other studios helping us. It was very expensive. It's one of the mistakes, like I mentioned earlier, when we try to have more impactful story beats within a year. So one of the big lessons then that we learned is that it's not about quantity. Player will always ask for more, but giving them more is not the answer because they're always going to want more. So this year, big improvement was actually around the investment around players. When going from Destiny 1 to Destiny 2, we saved some data and we told the players that we remembered what they did. The very first experience of booting the game, Destiny 2, and later on with through character dialogue being different if you did accomplish some things in Destiny 1 or not. We told them that what they did in the past mattered and we remembered. Player might react a little bit differently, say different line. This is not branching narrative. It's more adapting to what the player did in a game. At the start of Destiny 2, the player actually lost all their items from Destiny 1. But the player character is the same. Having continuity between Destiny 1 and Destiny 2 for the player was really important, was critical. The challenge to bring items was more technical. We could have started with a brand new character, but we decided to keep that continuity because, again, it was really core to the experience of the game as a service. So those are, so it's the same year. I just put the characters just to see how much we invest in characters in that moment and how that evolved later on. So overall, the story did not focus a lot on characters. I would say as a through line. That worked well when you're doing small epic campaign, but doesn't work when you're trying to have a more serialized story. So each expansion had 2 major characters, but because their stories were told mostly through a small campaign, it didn't satisfy the players that wanted those stories to continue after the few hours of the campaign. So by focusing on individual characters and not bringing forward the character in the original campaign, it means that you have to put character on the side for sometimes a very long time. It didn't feel good because players get attached to characters and they don't get to hang out with them more. So next year, it was Forsaken, 2018. This was a big change. We changed a lot of things in the game, and mostly it's really where we start embracing the game as a service framework. So we started to talk about that framework without necessarily understanding what it meant at the time or how we would change the way we tell stories. But we felt it was the right direction to go. So we established a rhythm with seasons every 3 months, when in the past we had 2 big DLC. Now we have a smaller season every 3 months. We lean more into replayable activity. We knew that what happened the year before with the big expansion was not sustainable. So we looked in ways to have more replayability in a more sustainable way. And we understood also that it's not what player wanted, what happened last year. So it was a way to react to it and try to propose something different. We also investigate and learn new ways to tell story beyond a campaign and a mission with some dialogue. We focused more on building the world, adding lore as a reward that player can chase, just like any other item in the world. Narrative beats were locked behind player progression post-campaign. So they were able to hope and see more story being developed after finishing the campaign for long-term engagement. For example, we had some narrative content that could get unlocked up to 20 weeks after launch. It turned out that it was too much, but we had to find the right balance. So in Forsaken, we're really starting to learn the systems that we need and how players are engaging with our stories beyond a big campaign. But the story is still isolated. Forsaken is focused around Aldrin Sov as the main villain. For those who don't know, is that guy. And so is the main villain is a brother of Mara Sov here under him. At the start of Forsaken of the story, Aldrin kills Kate 6. Create a lot of drama early on in the campaign. The whole campaign is about taking that revenge against Aldrin. Kate 6 was a really beloved character in Destiny. It created a really big story beat for Forsaken. But you can see that none of the Forsaken characters are present in any of the seasons of the year. The direction was still trying to create stories that could be independently chosen by players without having to rely on previous knowledge. So, for example, a player could not play Forsaken, not buy Forsaken, but could buy the second season. We did attempt to create some connection when possible. So, for example, in Blue, there's a plot connection. So even they are linked with each other. Spider is introducing us to Ada 1, the character from the December season. It's a handoff from Forsaken to Black Armory season. The challenge here again is that some player might not have played Forsaken and never have met a Spider. So we had to write things in a way that couldn't make sense for every player. One of the attempt of serialized storytelling that we did was the presence of a cinematic showing Aldrin resurrection as a guardian. Remember that he was a villain of the story of Forsaken. So having him being chosen to become a guardian, a good guy, creates a lot of mystery. So we did that. So in red, I'm representing the character heartbeats. So that's a connection because Aldrin's soft resurrection is disconnected from the Black Armory story. It happened in the timeline of the season, but was not connected. The biggest problem is that there wasn't any follow through. So it was a big tease without any payoff. But it created a great discussion in the community. It's something that we definitely pay attention to, and the potential to create some cliffhanger like that is definitely something that we thought about for later on. Next season, Drifter. So the season was focused on the character of Drifter. He was introduced in Forsaken, and the season dived in this character. So there is a connection, but it still feels isolated because there isn't a through line across the year. Just like previous years, each story after the annual release feels like a branch or a spin-off. So the blue lines make the content feel connected, but it creates dependency. The red lines make the player care about what's happening, less relying on what happened before, but add depth to what is happening now. As a side note, we did some stories that were trying to connect each season around some exotic weapon. So you see those 3 weapons were available in each of those seasons. And there is a story focused on one guardian called Trejanior that is told through lore and is associated with those 3 weapons and the quest associated with the weapon. It's more hidden, less easy to access for more players. But again, it was just us trying to find a way to build stories in a structure that match what players seems to ask for. Next year, 2019, the year of Shadowkeep. So a big new improvement for Shadowkeep is that we've created a new free portion of the game that everyone can experience called New Light. The game also became free to play. So we created that first experience for players to jump in and have a sense of what Destiny is. It was very limited, but it was the first step, again, knowing where we want to go and trying to create content that we can. So it's a big deal because it means that new player can now jump in Destiny at any time and be introduced to the world without having to play any of the previous release. So for the first time, also we had an annual release and a season at the same time. So Shadowkeep and Season of the Undying, they came out at the same time. At the time, it looked like it made sense to combine effort and to keep the player in the same place and talk to the same people. But it's difficult to have 2 avenues for players and have 2 different stories being told and sharing some elements. As a player, what do I follow? What is the most important thing for me to do? It's really difficult to get that message clear in the game. So forcing the stories to share the moon as a location created some confusion. Another improvement that we made that year was around the reuse of content. That's why it's checked. So we really started to improve what we call our ritual loops. If we want the player to connect and log in every week, what will they do? We saw before that we can't just create new content to have a weekly stream of content. It can become very expensive very quickly. So we have to rely on replaying the same content. But if you pair that with some evolving narrative, even if it's the same content, it feels less repetitive for players. That's something that we improved in each season, and we really, I think, get a good sense of what it was by Season of Arrivals. So it was a year of transition for the team. The target of the game as a service is now at the time more clear, but it took time to switch our process to execute on it. Like I said, Season of Arrivals, for a lot of reasons, feels like the first beat that really embraced that new form of storytelling. And you can see here with the characters that the last season had way much more characters than the previous one. We had to change our process and workflow just to be able to have more characters, more voice actor being recorded, and changing the way we tell story to not focus on one or two, but to a cast of characters. But there are still actually isolated stories. We connected the annual release and the season, like we said, but not in a way that was satisfying for players. So we started to get a sense of the connective tissue on the world level. Season of the Worthy here with Vala and Abrae is about the big cosmic thread that is center of the Shadowkeep story. So we set up a big event in the world in the Shadowkeep story with the discovery of that ancient enemy, a big pyramid. Season of Dawn don't really mention it that much. Season of the Worthy is about those characters trying to deal with what it means. So there is a connection between Shadowkeep and that season. Then that thread is being somewhat paid off in Season of Arrivals. In Season of the Worthy, we have a warning that the pyramid are arriving, and Season of the Arrival, they are arriving. They are there. And that connection will continue in Beyond Light, the following year annual expansion. So we started to shift from individual isolated stories to character stories that are affected by the change in the world. The world is moving forward, the characters are reacting to it. Now, let's talk about this past year. That's the interesting stuff. Because the 2021 sees the result of a lot of learnings of the past years, with more stability in the Destiny team at large and a better sense of what the target is. Access to content. So we reworked our free portion of the game to better introduce the world of Destiny. We added in Shadowkeep, but it wasn't as successful. Now we have a new character, a bigger quest. The challenge there, it is required content somewhat to understand the story, but it's short, an hour or two at most. We adapted our story delivery in seasonal content to have the main beats being delivered without a lot of grind or game time. In the past, we saw story beat as a reward, so we made the player work for it. That didn't work as well, not for every beat. This time, we make the story easier to be accessed for most of the players. So the time required to follow the main story is reduced, and even free player can experience some of that story. This is also a story where we introduce the Helm. The Helm is a space dedicated to seasons where the characters and the stories exist without having to overlap with the annual release or to have to deal with the multiplayer aspect of the game that add a lot of constraints to the story. That space adds a lot of clarity and allows us to have the gameplay space. It allows us to have a gameplay space to react to the world events from the season. Stream of content. So we extended the availability of season content so that you have more time to finish it, reducing the fear of missing out that we had before. In the past, you had to finish a season during that season. Now, even when the season ends, you can still go back and finish the main story beat of that season. We positioned the annual release in Beyond Light as the catalyst of the year story, impacting the world and several characters. Season of Arrivals from the year before had a small link to Beyond Light, but this year we are using the last season Season of the Lost to be the preamble of the next actual release, annual release, the Witch Queen. So playing Season of the Lost gives more insight into the Witch Queen, but it will not be required to have played that season to understand the Witch Queen story. You can actually be a brand new player and jump in for the Witch Queen and have an awesome experience. Invested players. This year we are paying off more stories from the past that we did ever before. So all the investment that player put in a game, they are seeing those being acknowledged and rewarded by story beats that are paying off what we established maybe for years just before. Reuse and replay. We improve even more the framework with our seasonal and annual activity that allow the player to have a satisfying amount of new content while still relying on replayability, delivering new pieces of story along the way so it feels more meaningful to engage in those weekly rituals. Calendar matters. We added a new seasonal event in May, so now every season has its own event. And we already were doing good with identification with players. So the main evolution that impacted our storytelling this year was our approach to a more connected, serialized form of narrative. To understand what we did and how it differs from previous year, let's look at each season individually. I'm going to go a little bit into Destiny weeds, but it'll make sense in the end, I hope. So first, the annual release. Beyond Light puts the player in the middle of the main conflict of Destiny. So it's a battle between light and darkness, between the Traveler and the Pyramids. So it's not an isolated story. It feels for the player that we are answering mysteries that have been present for a long time. The Red War, the first Destiny 2 campaign, was very much about the light and what it means to be a Guardian. Forsaken was about that thin line between light and darkness. Shadowkeep was about darkness, its insidious ways, using trauma of characters to attack them. Beyond Light offers the player to the ability to wield a darkness power for the first time. So once we understand what everything is, now we ask them to basically use the bad stuff. So the characters in the world, villain included, they're reacting to what is happening in the world. So the player is in the middle of the crisis for the Fallen, where Aramis, the villain and the leader of the Fallen City, is promising a better future to our people, but is consumed by a thirst of revenge, fueled by darkness power given by the Pyramids. On the other side, we have Varix, another Fallen, friendly Fallen, that is asking for our help, seeing Aramis making the wrong choice and ask us to help another Fallen leader, Mithrax, to evacuate Europa where Beyond Light takes place. Zavala, as always, is our rock, being used here as a voice of caution about using darkness power, something that Guardian never did before. And we are reintroducing the Exostranger, one of the main characters from Destiny 1. We never had a resolution and had a complex time traveling story that we're resolving in Beyond Light. So we are displaying all that backstory and officially revealing her identity as Anna Bray's sister, Elsie Bray. So we took some element from Destiny 1 campaign, from the As a Wolf expansion of Destiny 1, from the Destiny 2 Warmind expansion, all the lore around Elsie Bray and the Exo. So we took all that to build the Beyond Light campaign. We thought of it as a continuation of what we did in the past and taking some element to bring them forward to answer some mysteries. Season of the Hunt started at the same time as Beyond Light. So we improved the experience that we did, mistake that we did with Shadowkeep and Season of the Undying. This time, the story of Season of the Hunt takes place in a different destination and is not sharing any characters. In a way, it still feels disconnected, but at least we avoided confusion. The player are able to better choose and understand what stories they're following and when. The story focus of Season of the Hunt, the story of Season of the Hunt focuses on Uldren Sov. Is another character that was introduced in Destiny 1, that was the main villain of Forsaken. Remember, he died, got resurrected as a guardian, but we never talked about it since. He killed Cade, that was the most beloved character in the universe at the time. Many players had really strong feeling towards him. So he got resurrected 2 years ago at the time. So it's a very long time to follow through a story beat. We can't expect players to know what happened or who that character is. But Season of the Hunt brings that character back to the foreground. Not only the character is back, but it's also start his redemption arc. Like I said, many players really hated him in Forsaken, and now we are asking player to help him, to befriend him. It creates great dramatic tension. It also reintroducing Osiris. It's the start of a journey for that character that will be present through the whole year. The season is also featuring Spider. The only friendly fallen that we had in our universe at the time was Vex and Spider. So at least thematically, the season and the annual release are connected that way. The antagonist that we do not see in the season is Xivu Wrath, which is a sister of Savathun. Remember Savathun as a name. You can forget about Xivu Wrath. All that means that it's something that we're planting seeds towards the Witch Queen that happened a year later. And having a roadmap allows us to start planting seed here. Without it, it would have been very difficult to build up the tension. It would have been a more isolated one-off story like we did in the past. Season of the Chosen answer another threat left hanging. If you remember in Destiny 2, the Red War, we killed the leader of the Cabal. Since that time, we never said who was the leader of the Cabal. We have not introduced a face as the leader of that faction. And without a face, the combatants feels less impactful because there is no personal stake in the conflict. So in this season, we introduce that leader of the Cabal as being Kaido, as the leader of the Cabal. The redemption arc for Uldren Sov continue this season as being a character that the player go and talk to quite a lot. We are connecting it visually also through the great work of our thematic team that connects the moment that in Forsaken, where Uldren kills Cade. That's a picture from thematic. And in season, in that season, we have not the same moment, another thematic where Uldren saves Zaval's life, fall on the floor, and Zavala help him pick it up. That also create links between past content and our current content that is not necessary to know, but create depth in the player experience if you know what happened and you understand the meaning of it. Osiris is present too, next to Zavala, and Osiris as a character the player talked to. In this season, Osiris start acting weird in some uncharacteristic ways. We again start planting some mystery and seed there. The story of the Cabal could have felt like previous ones, disconnected to previous stories in some way, but now it's the characters are creating that connective tissue. Next season, Season of the Splicer, that season connect directly with Beyond Light. Putting the evacuation of the Fallen from Europa and Mithrax that we mentioned in Beyond Light is now at the center of the story. Mithrax was actually introduced in the Red War, in Destiny 2 Red War. It was one of the rare Fallen friendly to human and was a beloved character for a very short amount of screen time, but it never really made it to the forefront. It feels connected. It feels like the event of Beyond Light still have an impact in the world. In Beyond Light, we talk about evacuating Fallen. In Season of the Spicer, we actually see the evacuated Fallen because they are living in the city amongst us and other people. That's one of the things that the addition to the helm at that private space for the player and for the seasonal content allowed us to do. It was a need that we had before that we understood, and that year we were able to execute on it and allow us to tell better stories. Eldrin and Osiris are present, continuing their arc also in that season. Osiris specifically acts more and more strangely, and by the end of the season, it's clear that there is something wrong with him. Finally, Season of the Lost sees the culmination of all those character arcs. This is a season that is happening right now. Go play it. The season focused on Savathun. Remember that character that we'd start planning a little bit before. Savathun was actually introduced and talked about since Destiny 1, probably. Yes, Destiny 1. And was always present in the lore, really, as an underground character. It's our Loki in a way. And she becoming more and more present that year because she will be the main character of the Witch Queen coming out in February 2022. Just at the end of Season of the Lost. So the season's main character is Marasov, the sister, sister of Uldren Sov. Uldren finally meets her again in their home, the Dreaming City, things that they didn't do since Forsaken. It's a moment that players were anticipating since he was resurrected as a guardian just after Forsaken, because he lost his memory, so he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't recognize his sister. He doesn't recognize his own home. So putting those two characters together in that place is also a moment that player really wanted to see. We also revealed that Osiris that we have seen in the 3 previous seasons was not Osiris, but was actually Savathun impersonating him. Osiris' behavior in the past season was at times odds. Like we said, it created mystery that we are finally paying off in Season of the Lost. So it's a lot. And that's a lot of connection. I'm not going to go in detail on all those connections. The only thing I would say on the slide is that that is why it's working today. Lots of red connection, creating a reason to care for players about characters. Blue connection, not in between seasons, but looking out and from the annual release. So those are the big world events. So the learnings for Destiny might not apply to all the games, but for us, we really found success in mostly doing 3 things. Focusing on an ensemble cast of characters with dramatic emotional arc and reveal. It's not about the big events happening a lot. It's about what the characters are doing. You don't need a big expensive cinematic to be a big narrative moment. Like I said, the moment when Uldren finally see her sister is a big moment because players are expecting and anticipating it. Regular weekly character beats integrated to the weekly gameplay ritual. There's an expectation, like I said early on, that players have that story keep moving forward. We have to find the right balance. Weekly, that's how the game reset. Every time the game reset, there's an expectation for players to see a little bit of new story. So it doesn't have to be a big thing, but having that stream of content, giving a little bit of story that evolves a little bit is really important. And finally, building an active roadmap. That's critical because the roadmap allows us to move the world forward in a big ways in the annual release and to be those big tentpoles that the previous season looked to. And once the annual release is shipped, that also impacts the next seasons. It's not a connection that every player needs to know in details, but it's big enough and happen only once a year. It's enough for a player to understand and the context of it when they play a season. That's it. So in conclusion, the game as a service framework comes with its own challenges for storytelling. It's not an easy road. It requires a lot of resources to deliver what Destiny does every week, every season, or every year. We couldn't have done it without the support of the community of players and the dedication and the talent of the narrative team at Bungie also. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now.
Yes, thank you so much, Guillaume. And we do actually have a couple of questions that are in the Q&A right now. Really quickly, I do want to remind you all that the Q&A option at the bottom of Zoom is there. So while we're answering these questions, feel free to keep queuing them up. We have some time. So yeah, let's go to the Q&A.
So in order, I guess, is there another? Oh,
you can click on the, if you want, you can click on the Q&A button at the top of the Zoom toolbar, or I can
yeah, no,
however you want. Oh, okay.
Which one is first? But I'll take the top one is first.
Okay.
So
yeah,
question from Jason Corbett. With storytelling taking a more prominent role in Destiny with the latest seasons, how has the relationship between the narrative design and gameplay design evolved to accommodate that shift? How collaborative is the planning between the teams, or does one take the lead at different times? So I would say it's so what we did, the result that we have is because our relationship changed. It would have been possible. It's not just the effort of the narrative team itself. In a lot of ways, it's really leadership, understanding where the target is, like I said, trying to do a game as a service, putting the resources where they need to be, giving the space and the time of the narrative team to be able to do that work. So in a way, the relationship had to be closer first to be able to deliver the beat that we have. The planning is sometimes not difficult, but we don't have a lot of time often to plan the beats, and it's a game where design is first, which makes a lot of sense, and design can evolve. The challenge is to be able to react so that narrative cannot be too close to something that it planned to in gameplay, because there needs to be some freedom around gameplay iteration to make the game fun to play. So it's design first with a strong collaboration with narrative, and narrative on their side have to understand that they need to be able to react if needed, so they have to be flexible. I hope that answered your question. Don't hesitate to ask for more details if you would like to. Next question from Jacob Long. What is the best way for young or inexperienced game writer to market themselves, and what would you suggest to those looking for a position to contribute to the stories being told through video games? It really also depends on what you want to do, because game writers are, I would say, studios have a very different understanding of what a game writer is, and even more than that, I would say, of narrative designers, because it's a different role depending on the type of game you work on. Some game studio really expect a narrative designer to be mostly a writer. Some game studio will expect a narrative designer to be more of a designer that can also write a little. So first you have to understand what you want to do. Do you want to write more or do more narrative design? And then understanding then what the studio are asking for, because if you are mostly a writer and apply for a job, the studio asks for more narrative designer, it's not going to work. Not because of the skill of writing, it's just because they can't have a team maybe for too many people, so they have to find someone that fits exactly their need. So first, know what you want to do, target the studios that propose the type of job that you want to do, and show a portfolio. And that can be simple writing example. It could be sometimes some interactive fiction can work, but again, depending on the type of game. For example, for Destiny, if someone comes with some games on some interactive fiction, that doesn't really help me understand how well that will fit in the team. What I'm looking for more for Destiny, it's actually more some screenplay experience, because when we write missions, it's close to not a movie, but there's some dialogue writing. And I'm looking for another type of people that are more lore writing. So it's someone that will be really good with prose and really visual, and you could have a written short story or novel. So those are very different type of role. But understanding what the studio is looking for and providing a portfolio that match that is the best way. Next question, Quinn Williams. How do you strike a balance between making the player feel important in the world and navigate break immersion that there are only one of many very similar players? It's a great question, and it's a big challenge that we often face. And like, for example, I said earlier that it's important in the game as a service for the player to feel invested, that it's the player playing another character. We try actually early on to strike that balance more or less. And one thing, for example, that you can see that we evolved is how often the player speaks in the release. We actually plan to have the Destiny 2 campaign with a character that speaks a lot, but we have to pull back on that for many reasons. I still push for the character to speak at times, but it's really important to know what the character says. It shouldn't be something that doesn't match what the player behind the screen that think at that moment. Something that some moment can be really impactful. For example, in Forsaken, when Kate died and we had Zavala and Ikora not knowing what to do, trying to argue about should we revenge him or not, while the player speaks and say something like, I'll do it. That's what the player think at the moment. So it's really impactful because there is a connection between the character on screen and what I think as a player. The other side of it, that's more the question, is that I'm not the only Guardian. There's many Guardians. And it's something that we try to balance, but there is that Destiny live in that weird place where there is still a campaign with a kind of classic story of a hero's journey. If at the same time you're telling a hero's journey, you tell the player how special he is, and at the same time you say, yeah, but there are many of you, it kind of counter that feeling. So that's one of the places where I feel like we don't have a good answer when we're trying to tell the stories. We try to say it at times to acknowledge those others, but most of the time we just try not to mention it and hope it works. But it is a big challenge that we, like I said, we don't have the answer yet. What is the difference between being a writer and an narrative designer? That's a great question, because many people in the industry still do not know also. So I can give you my answer, but if you talk to someone else, they might have a different answer. I mean, the very simple answer is that a writer's write and a narrative designer designs. When you write something as just a writer, it means your main focus is on the words, being a wordsmith, whether it's lore, prose writing, or dialogue writing, your focus in on writing words. With that, I always expect to be also an expert in story structure. You need to understand how to tell the story. A narrative designer could be the same, but what's important is that you understand the language of a video game. That's very that's very important, because there's many types of video games. and you're not going to write the same way for Destiny or Uncharted or Animal Crossing or whatever. So the narrative designer really understands what the game needs, what is the best way to tell the story in that specific game, and then writes or work with a writer to write. But that is true that a lot of jobs you might see ask for a writer and they expect to be a narrative designer. Sometimes you see a job for a narrative designer and they expect a writer. I would say me personally, I come more from cinema and movies, so I'm more visual. I started as a cinematic director, like I said, and switched to narrative design. So I'm not a writer. I don't consider myself a writer. I do some writing sometimes, but I'm not a writer. And I know that's often shock people because they see me in my position and it's like, oh, you must be a writer. And like, no, it's narrative design is very different. So you can have a career as a narrative designer without actually being a good writer, but it helps to be everything. Next question. Quinn Williams. Oh no, did I answer that? Yes. Brett Patrick. How does Bungie decide when to use certain I assume it's presentation method for story, scripted events, cutscene, voice, dialogue, etc. So it's it depends on the story we want to tell and our budget. For example, I was on an annual release, we know we have a budget for, I don't know exactly, but let's say 6 cinematics. So when we tell the story, we know what our main beats are, and we say, okay, that beats needs to be a cinematic. So we're going to use that moment for that. If there is a strong character moment, something emotional that requires some close-up on faces, that's going to be a cinematic. That's the first step to identify the really big story beats. Then it's more, when looking at the story we're trying to tell, it's like, what can we afford? What can we do? So often I wish we had more cinematics for some things. I wish we had actually sometimes more dialogue also. So in missions, we often have to account for the combat happening. It really depends on designing the missions. We have to ask for time to set up beats. But the difference is really how important, how big is the story beat. You know that if you put it in cinematic, people are going to see it and going to impact it. If you put something in a mission dialogue, some player might not hear it. So there is some prioritization about how critical it is for the players to hear it, to hear that story beat, and how focused you want them to be. And then we classify that. That's why we often also have a lot of story we want to tell that don't make it into whether dialogue or cinematic, and we use the lore on the side to expand this type of story that would be too expensive to tell in the game itself. Next one, Rob Lloyd. Since titles and role changes from studio to studio, what keywords or phrases can an applicant look for to understand whether the job is more design or writing focused? Like I said, it's tricky because often the studio themselves don't really know what they need. But you can look into the required skills. Often they put something specifically, or the expected what the role, the task expected for the role. If it is collaboration with design on systems, for example, narrative systems, that would be more narrative design. If it's specifically write dialogue, I think you can find those words. Again, the tricky part is that the game studio or the team doesn't necessarily know exactly what they need. So the job application might not fit exactly what the role is. But the best thing is to see also the type of game that people want to, and looking at the job offer. For example, Uncharted, or Naughty Dog don't have narrative people. Not a lot. I mean, they have writers. They don't have narrative designers. So game designer is building the mission, working with a writer, but there is no narrative designer. And that, I know that just because looking at the job that they have and seeing that when they see a writer, it's mostly because the game is really focused on design, and game design is really the driver of the experience. So simple answer, it's difficult to know. Look for cues in what the task or expectations are, but the best is to ask if there's an interview. Rob, again, what are entry-level writers or narrative designer likely to be expected to do? Will they get to write inventory item, name, description, or 25 ways to say owl? Yeah, I understand as a writer, you want to write a great story with some really emotional character moments. But it is true that the first task as an entry level is not going to be the big emotional scenes. It's going to be a lot of different way to say owl, or a lot of item or icon to name. In Destiny, for example, you can listen to the ambient dialogue when you go next to a character and they're going to say things. That's the kind of thing I give to an entry level, because it's low impact, but it's also a very easy way for me to see if that person is trying to bring some emotion, even in those one-off line. It's not because it seems easy or non-impactful that you shouldn't try to make it impactful. And a name, for example, in Destiny, names are really important. Of course, there's some more important than others, but naming something is really critical because players are going to say that name a lot. So being able to capture in one name the fantasy or some emotion or something from the past is not easy at all. So even if it seems like a simple task, there is a lot that can be done to really add to the experience. Patrick McGrath, with so many characters, faction, plot thread, how it is decided which character conflict will be focused on in each season or expansion? How they complement the story of the content? The last time they appeared or were focused on, etc. So as you might have seen, it's really evolved for us. And it's it depends when. In the past, it's not necessarily really interesting to talk about it because it was kind of not random, but because we didn't have a roadmap, it wasn't really thought in a way that was helpful to the narrative. Now we have the roadmap, so we kind of know where we want to go. So just looking at that here, for example, we kind of knew where we want to go towards the end of the year. So we knew we wanted to have some character being present. We knew that we want to have Aldrin, for example, having a redemption arc. So it means that we need to find a way to have him present in all the season, knowing what the last bit will be. Then there is, for Beyond Light, for example, my goal was to try to bring creating connection with Destiny 1. And that's why we picked Varix. We knew it was a Fallen story. So we picked Varix as the main matter. We also bring the Exo Stranger because he's a character from Destiny 1 that felt that didn't have a resolution. So it was an opportunity to bring that resolution, or at least to bring it back in the forefront. So how it is decided is depending on the roadmap. And the roadmap is created from our narrative director and leadership and with a team together. We have stuff we want to do, like we have great ideas for Zavala, where does it need to go, or Ikora. So we discuss as a group, and then we see where does that fit in the roadmap, what can we use to really use the character arc as a catalyst of the main plot. Jason Corbett, how far out do you have to start planning season now? How much can you change as you approach the release of the season before art and voiceover is locked in? So I'm not working on the seasons, so my knowledge is not precise, but I'm in close contact with them. But so a season is roughly 6 months of production between when we start concepting to when it has to be done. The challenge with a season is that it takes time to create a thematic and to record voiceover. So that's why we need that flexibility that I talked about before. It happened already that we had the team write scripts, records the voiceover, and when the voiceover come back, the design change and doesn't work. That happened too often, I would say. And it's not, I'm not saying that as a job to design or art. It's part of the process. They have to iterate and being able to be flexible themselves. So a season needs to be locked in a few months, I believe, before it comes out. So there is not a lot of late change we can make. So the iteration are really kind of in the middle of production. And the more challenging is semantics, because it takes time to create a semantic. And we have to write the scripts first. So we have to align on the bit of semantic first, independently of the ritual for the season, for example. So that's why when you play a season, you might see that some disconnect between the semantic and what's happening in a mission. It's probably because we're trying to shift a little bit during production, but as much as possible, we're trying to keep communication and collaboration very close to avoid that.
Unmute there. Okay. Oh, awesome. Thank you, Guillaume. I think Rob might be typing something up. I'm not 100% sure. Oh, here it is. Cool. Yeah, similarly, it seems Magic the Gathering has a design-driven game with lore and story adapting to the desired design focus points. Can you speak to a design-driven element that was particularly difficult to fit into the narrative?
Trying to think, because there's one coming in mind is Witch Queen, but I can't really talk about that.
Yeah, I realize that's maybe a bit too behind the scenes, asking you to
no, not at all.
But there must be times when you wanted to say no to design.
Yeah, no, definitely. And sometimes we say no and we don't do it. And sometimes we say no and they say, well, let's talk more. And we have to find a way. And I personally evolved also for that. I used to be in a place where if it doesn't make sense for a story, I don't like it and I'm fighting against it. Now my position is often, well, we can make anything work, right? It's narrative, and often we've been asked to make really crazy thing work. It's part of the job. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then again, it's a video game, so you have to be flexible. The way I always challenge those decisions that may feel weird is always go back up a level and trying to understand what is the goal or what is the theme, what are we trying to do? And for example, actually, I want an example where I said no and we didn't do it. For Shadowkeep, so the theme and the tone of the moon is haunted by ghosts. The tone, I mean, the theme of the game is really about trauma. The main character, every morning, is being haunted by our friends that are died, and it's just a manifestation of her own trauma and guilt. One of the designers had a great idea of a silly game for players to go on the moon, and by doing some drinking something or pushing a button, they can get transparent, and they would have to go behind another player and push a button and say boo, and it scares them. It's fun, and that would be part of a little secret. But it didn't match the tone. And my fear was that trying to create that tone of well, not depressing, but at least a serious tone of trauma and being down, having something, imagining the players on a destination go behind and say boo to people, kind of break that. So that's why I went back and say, that's really fun. I love the idea, but what are we trying to do? What is the goal? Does that idea help us reach that goal or reinforce the goal? And there it was clear no, so we didn't do it. So there's always that back and forth to understand what we're trying to do and finding sometimes some design ideas that are really cool. But if it goes against a fiction, that we have a good argument to say, well, we can't do that because this is what we said. And it's sometimes very difficult because the fiction can be a little vague at times. So we always have to bring our own judgment and saying, well, those are the words being said that we shipped. What does that mean? And we did that a lot. We evolved our fiction a lot in our understanding and bringing more clarity that sometimes is actually different than what the player interpreted themselves. But internally, we always trying to, and to be honest, the people in our team, our design and art are also big fan of the game. And some know the fiction and the lore a lot. So it's when we bring argument around the fiction, we don't often have to fight a lot. It makes sense, like, oh, I didn't know, and totally, and we try to find a solution that still reinforce the fiction instead of going against it. So there's a new question I see.
Yes.
Patrick, what are some unique challenges when planning out a multi-year story arc? Well, there are many challenges. One of the so first, it's like we went through several roadmap for the year, and it makes sense when you make it to have the roadmap you're trying to see for the next few months or season or year. But the game changed, and like we saw in Destiny, the game did change, and there can be many reasons, right? But so the roadmap has to be flexible also. I think planning too far ahead is dangerous in terms of specifics, because the specifics can evolve. What I found more successful is trying to plan ahead, again, in thematically where you want to go, so that the execution of that can change. But putting a theme out pretty early allow all the teams to know it and to have that in mind when they think about their own planning. But if you say some things very specific, like, for example, are a character gonna die in 2 years from now, that is so specific that there is 99% chances that it's not gonna happen, because so many things might change between now and then. So again, flexibility is really important. Flexibility in your own work, but being able to put something out and communicating out to other teams early is also really important, because you can start influencing other teams and they will think about their own work in those elements, but not on the execution side, more in the high level theme or tone, something like, oh, that's where we want to go, around that direction, and they're going to think it that way. AJ, yesterday, if you can speak to it, what is your pipeline process within the writing narrative design space? How do you go from overarching theme to specific script, storyboard? So it depends. Also, it's kind of organic in a way. Like I said, the first thing we have to deliver are cinematic scripts. To get there, we have to understand what our main story is. We can still leave out a lot of things that we don't have the details for yet and are going to come later. But to get to a cinematic script, we have to understand the story first. The story is mainly being told through the campaign first. So our first step is aligning. There's a lot of alignment and collaboration with other teams, aligning on what does the destination looks like, who's living there, what combatants are living there, why are they there, who's the main villain, and And one by one, we try to talk with those elements with all the other teams, and then we'll look at the campaign, like what is the main story of the campaign? And we know, okay, there's going to be a thematic here and here and here. We align with a campaign team of roughly what the mission will be, and then we start writing thematic scripts. So that's our first objective, aligning on a high level with everybody. Then aligning with the campaign team around what the campaign is. And then there is a lot of collaboration with design and art on everything else to try to align. And so we bring ideas, they bring ideas, we're trying to make them work. At first, it's always a little bit scary because we have to make decisions early, like with the campaign thematics. And those are the tentpoles that are pretty immovable for the rest of the project. The goal is by the end to have a lot of content, from those really expensive thematic to the name of everything to all the content, to feel like a cohesive whole that kind of fits different sides of the spectrum. At first, we don't know how we're going to get there. So part of it is trusting the process. And again, having really high level theme and direction as goals is really important, because that way you don't have to look at every little piece. As long as you set a direction, everybody can look in the same direction, and everything in the end, the output of every team gonna feel connected. So again, collaboration is the key word, because there's a lot of back and forth until we know what to do, and then we start writing. And the next deadline is really recording voiceover from actors. But and there is several recording sessions, because again, things might shift a little bit and change. But the scary part is always to try to make decisions early on and to stick to them, and hopefully they will stick for the rest of the team too. And I know it's a kind of vague answer, because there is no clear process, right? It's really organic. It's a lot of collaboration. When it feels good, you put it down. When it doesn't feel good, you keep working until you can't work on it anymore, and you have to be done. But it's really a lot of back and forth with other teams.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Guillaume. If there are no more questions, then I think we are probably good for tonight. Guillaume, thank you again so much for doing this and taking the time out. This was absolutely excellent. It's always awesome to be able to peer into the process. And especially we have a lot of people out here who saw the question before, are a little unsure about the difference between narrative design and writing lead, and, you know, games of service, especially kind of a fairly new thing. I mean, it's been around for a little bit, but it's fairly new. So like being able to demystify that is so vital and so awesome. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. And again, narrative is still kind of new in the industry in a way. So it's still evolving. And even the people that start a career now are going to be the one defining what it's going to be in 10 years. So don't be afraid about not fitting in the mold right now, because like you said, game as a service was not a thing 10 years ago. So who knows what's going to exist in 10 years from now. It's a really dynamic environment that changed a lot. So learning about what the story is and what is interactivity is the two key things to become a narrative designer. Because again, it's going to change. What you can learn today is not what you're going to do in 10 years.
That is so true, and us who have been around for a bit know that very clearly. Awesome. Thank you so much again. I appreciate it. For everyone out there, I just want to say really quickly, we'll have news about what our December plans are very soon. We're also going to have information out there about what we're doing for elections. We're going to put up forms for you to nominate if you want to be on the IGDA board. That's coming up soon. Elections are in January. We'll have nomination forms up. We'll do voting. It's going to be a good time. So just keep that in mind. Those are things down the pipeline. Otherwise, we'll see y'all again soon. Everybody have a good night. Yeah,